Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Midnight Files. Tonight, you'll hear 13, a true story about crime, disappearance, and miraculous survival. If you like it, hit like, subscribe, so you can follow more fascinating stories, and let me know where you're listening and what time it is. Before we begin, please check your door locks, and maybe take a look out the window. Okay, let's get started. Outside, the rain had begun to fall. At first, just a few scattered drops, tapping lightly on the window pane, then it grew heavier, more consistent, until the sound of the rain became a white curtain, swallowing up all other sounds. The streets turned into small rivers, and the night sank into an eerie silence. It was on a night like this, at a quiet residential neighborhood in Setagaya, Tokyo, that a family of 4 was preparing for the new year. They had no idea that in a few hours, their home would become the site of the most baffling crime scene in Japanese history, where the killer wouldn't just flee into the night, but would instead decide to move in and make himself at home, while their bodies lay only a few feet away. But before we delve into that story, let's rewind time a little. It was December 30th, the year 2000. In the Setagaya ward of Tokyo, a man named Mikio Miyazawa was enjoying a peaceful evening. Mikio was 44 years old and worked as a consultant for a British marketing firm. He was a dedicated father, a quiet professional, and he lived in a modern, comfortable house with his wife, Yasuko, who was 41, and their 2 young children. Their daughter, Nina, was 8, and their son, Ray, was only 6. The neighborhood was typically crowded, but the Miyazawas lived in a specific section that was being cleared out for a park expansion. Because of this, most of their neighbors had already moved away. There were only a few houses left on their block. This meant that while the area was safe, it was also unusually isolated. On that particular Saturday night, the family was doing what most families do right before the turn of the millennium. They were relaxing, watching television, and likely thinking about their plans for the upcoming New Year celebration. Around 10:30 in the evening, Mikio was on his computer, checking his emails. Yasuko and the kids were likely upstairs, getting ready for bed. Everything seemed perfectly normal. The lights were on, the heater was humming, and the house was a sanctuary against the cold winter air. But outside, hidden in the shadows of the empty lot next door, someone was watching. Someone who had brought a backpack filled with extra clothes, a tactical knife, and a strange sense of calm. They were waiting for the right moment to strike. Around 11 o'clock, the intruder climbed over the fence and entered the property. He didn't break a window or kick down the front door. Instead, he used the second-floor window that led into the small bathroom. Once inside, the intruder moved with a terrifying level of confidence. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight toward the bedroom where young Ray was sleeping and strangled him. The sound of the struggle must have alerted Mikio, who was still downstairs. He rushed up the stairs to see what was happening, but he was met by the killer, who was armed with a sashimi knife. Mikio fought back with everything he had. Investigators later found that Mikio had sustained dozens of defensive wounds. He was a strong man, but the attacker was relentless and incredibly violent. After Mikio fell, the killer turned his attention to Yasuko and little Nina. They were on the top floor of the house, in a loft area. The killer attacked them with the same ferocity. At some point, the sashimi knife he was using actually broke because of the force he was applying. Undeterred, the killer went back downstairs, grabbed a kitchen knife from the Miyazawa's own drawer, and finished them. Now, at this point in most true crime stories, the killer would panic. They would realize the gravity of what they had done, wipe down their fingerprints, and vanish into the darkness before the police could be called. But that is not what happened in the Miyazawa house. Not even close. Instead of fleeing, the killer decided to stay. He spent the next several hours treating the house like a vacation rental. He went into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. He took out 4 containers of ice cream and ate them one by one. He didn't use a spoon. He just squeezed the containers and ate the contents. He also found some melon and a bottle of barley tea. He sat at the family's dining table, consuming their food, while the 4 victims remained exactly where they had fallen throughout the house. But he wasn't done. He went to Mikio's desk and turned on the computer. He spent time browsing the internet, specifically looking at the website of the company Mikio worked for. He even tried to book theater tickets online. This level of casual behavior, after committing a quadruple homicide is almost unheard of. It shows a person who was either completely detached from reality or felt a bizarre sense of ownership. The killer also went through the family's personal belongings. He didn't take much of value, which suggests that robbery wasn't the primary motive. Instead, he organized some of their documents into neat piles. He even used the bathroom, but he didn't flush. Most disturbingly, he used Yasuko's feminine hygiene products to bandage his own wounds, as he had been cut during the struggle with Mikio. He stayed in that house for at least 6 to 10 hours. He even took a nap on the family's sofa. It wasn't until the next morning, December 31st, that he finally decided to leave. He took off the blood-soaked clothes he had been wearing and left them neatly folded on the floor. He put on a fresh set of clothes he had brought in his backpack and simply walked out the front door into the morning light. The bodies were discovered by Yasuko's mother, who lived next door. She had been trying to call them, but couldn't get through. When she entered the house, she was met with a scene of absolute horror. The police arrived shortly after, and they were stunned by the amount of evidence left behind. There were fingerprints, blood samples, the killer's original clothes, and even his backpack and the broken knife. With all this evidence, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police were confident they would catch the guy within days. They had his DNA, which showed he was likely of mixed ancestry, part Japanese and part Southern European or Korean. They knew exactly what brand of clothes he wore, and even what kind of sand was on his shoes. Yet, 26 years later, the identity of the Setagaya killer remains a total mystery. The case remains open, with a massive reward offered for any information. Every year on the anniversary of the murders, police officers visit the house to pay their respects and vow to find the perpetrator. The house itself still stands, encased in a protective structure, a silent monument to a night of inexplicable cruelty and the stranger who stayed for tea. As the investigators in Tokyo struggled to reconcile the massive amount of physical evidence with the total lack of a suspect thousands of miles away in Germany, another family was about to face a nightmare that would take over a decade to truly understand. This next story begins at a humble roadside flower stall, where a hard-working man was just trying to provide for his children. The sun was high over the city of Nuremberg on that 6th day of the week during the afternoon. It was the 9th part of the 9th month in the era of the turn of the century. A 38-year-old male named Enver Simsek was busy setting up his mobile enterprise. Enver was a hard-working migrant who had built a successful life as a flower merchant. He spent his daylight hours traveling between various spots to sell beautiful blossoms. Enver had parked his white Mercedes transport on the side of a busy thoroughfare known as Liegnitzer Strasse. This was a typical stop for him. He was a male of habit and discipline. His primary goal in life was to provide a bright future for his 2 teenage kin back at their flat. He worked long hours, often starting well before dawn, to ensure his botanical trade thrived in this competitive European market. The air was warm and smelled of lilies. As he stood inside the rear of his vehicle, arranging colorful bouquets for the afternoon rush, he was completely focused on his tasks. He had no reason to feel unsafe. Nuremberg was a bustling hub, and he was a well-liked figure in the community. However, a gloom was unfolding in the shade of the nearby trees. 2 individuals were approaching his position, carrying firearms that were hidden from view. They moved with a chilling, calculated intent. Without warning, the 2 culprits reached the open portals of the transport. They did not shout demands or ask for cash. Instead, they raised their barrels and began a rapid barrage of projectiles. Enver was trapped in the small space with nowhere to run. 8 distinct impacts struck his frame in a matter of seconds. The sound of the gunfire was partially muffled by the traffic on the road, but the carnage inside the metal hull was absolute. The slayers did not linger to check if their target was still breathing. They turned and vanished into the urban landscape as quickly as they had arrived. Left behind was a scene of sheer chaos. Enver was slumped against his crates of roses, his plasma leaking onto the floor. A passerby eventually noticed the commotion and alerted the medical teams. When the responders arrived, they found the merchant in a critical state, barely clinging to his existence. He was rushed to the local infirmary, where surgeons worked tirelessly for 2 days to save him. His spouse, Adil, waited in the hallway, her mind racing with questions and terror. She couldn't understand who would want to harm her partner. He had no enemies. He was a simple vendor. Sadly, the damage was too severe. On the 11th day of that month, just 48 hours after the assault, Enver passed away, leaving his lineage shattered and searching. The local agents took over the vicinity, but their approach was flawed from the very beginning. Instead of looking for external threats or hate-based motives, they turned their gaze toward the deceased himself. They assumed that a successful foreign merchant must have secret ties to illegal activities. They began to spin a narrative that involved illicit debts, organized syndicates from abroad, or internal disputes within the migrant community. It was a massive bias. For the next several years, the constabulary put Adile and her household through an emotional wringer. They questioned her for hours, suggesting that Enver had been living a double life. They searched their estate multiple times, looking for stashes of narcotics or ledgers of crooked deals. They even monitored their telephonic communications. The grief of losing a spouse was compounded by the constant insinuation that he was a rogue who deserved his final end. This pattern of inquiry continued as more similar incidents began to occur across the country. Between that era and the year 2006, 9 more males of foreign descent were gunned down in various cities. Each time, the method was identical. A specific type of handgun was used, and the targets were all small trade owners. Yet, the federal forces refused to connect the dots to a right-wing radical cell. They kept placing the blame on the victims. The breakthrough didn't come from a clever piece of work, but from a failed bank heist in the year 2011. 2 males, Uwe Mundlos and Uwe Bonhart, were found deceased in a burning motorhome in the town of Eisenach. They had ended their own lives after being cornered by the gendarmes. When the debris was sifted, the agents found something that sent shockwaves through the entire nation of Germany. It was a cache of stolen service revolvers. Hidden among the ruins was the Seska 83 handgun that had been used in all 10 of the unsolved slayings, including the execution of Enver Simsek. Along with the tool, they discovered a series of gruesome films that the group had produced. The footage mocked the deceased and claimed responsibility for the acts in the name of a neo-Nazi organization called the National Socialist Underground. The truth was finally out, but it came much too late. A third member of the cell, a female named B. Z. Shape, set fire to their shared residence in Zwickau before turning herself in. The ensuing court case became one of the most significant legal proceedings in modern history. It exposed deep-seated prejudices within the intelligence services and the enforcement agencies. They had ignored clear signals of far-right radicalization for over a decade, choosing instead to harass the grieving relatives of the men. Enver's progeny, who was only 14 when her patriarch was taken, eventually spoke out about the pain of those years. She described how the state had treated them like suspects rather than survivors. The apology from the government years later could not erase the memory of the slander. The case serves as a grim reminder of how institutional blindness can allow monsters to operate in broad daylight, hidden by the very systems meant to protect the general public. The legacy of the Simsek tragedy eventually forced a total overhaul of how hate crimes are monitored and investigated in the region. It led to new regulations and a commitment to transparency that had been sorely lacking during the turn of the century. While the culprits are gone, the scars remain on the fabric of the society. The blossom stall on Liegnitzer Strasse is gone, but the memory of the male who stood there, dreaming of a future, haunts the city. As the shock of the extremist revelations began to settle over the European continent, another tragedy was unfolding across the Atlantic Ocean in a very different setting. This time, the violence was not hidden in the shade of a quiet thoroughfare, but was broadcast live to millions of people in real time. It involved a crowded public transport vehicle in the heart of Rio de Janeiro, where a desperate soul took a group of commuters on a journey to a fatal end. The white Mercedes vehicle that Enver used was more than just a transport. It was his mobile workspace and his pride. On that fateful day, the temperature was hovering around 25 degrees. He had arrived at his spot early, around 7 o'clock, to beat the heat. The scent of fresh water and damp earth filled the interior of the vehicle as he trimmed the stems of his stock. He was wearing a light blue shirt and dark trousers, looking very professional. The 2 males who approached him were not from the local area. They had traveled from the eastern part of the country, fueled by a hateful ideology that saw people like Enver as intruders. They didn't see a provider or a merchant. They saw a mark. One of the males stood watch, while the other stepped up to the vehicle's ledge. The tranquility of the afternoon was shattered by the staccato rhythm of the handgun. a sound that would echo through the Simsek kin. The projectiles used were of a specific 9mm caliber. They pierced through the thin metal skin of the vehicle and the delicate petals of the blossoms before finding their mark. Enver's spectacles were knocked from his face, and he collapsed onto a pile of green foam. The attackers were so cold-blooded that they took a photograph of the dying male before they fled, a trophy for their twisted collection that would later be discovered by the agents. During the subsequent inquiries, the lead agent sat across from a dial and asked her if her spouse had a secret mistress or if he was secretly a kingpin in a heroin ring. They suggested that the 8 shots were a signature of a professional hit from a foreign syndicate. No matter how much she cried or insisted that he was a male of faith and integrity, they looked at her with suspicion. They even examined the lineage's bank accounts, questioning every single cent. The atmosphere in the Simsek residence became one of total paranoia. They felt watched not by the slayers, but by the state. Neighbors began to distance themselves, whispered rumors spreading through the local park that the Simseks were involved in something dirty. The progeny had to endure cruel comments at school, their patriarch's memory being dragged through the mud by a public that believed the official narrative. The true assassins were being shielded. When the motorhome in Eisenach finally went up in flames, it was a random event that changed everything. A local resident had reported a suspicious vehicle after a bank robbery. When the gendarmes approached, the 2 UVs realized their run was over. The fire was an attempt to destroy the evidence of their decade-long spree, but the heat was not intense enough to consume the heavy metal of the Seska handgun. That single piece of iron became the key to everything. Inside the ruins of the caravan, agents also found the service weapon of a female officer who had been slaughtered in Heilbronn in the year 2007. This was the 10th victim of the group. The connection was undeniable. The 2 males had been living in plain sight for years, supported by a network of sympathizers who provided them with funds, IDs, and safe dwellings. They had spent their dusk hours playing games and watching films, all while planning. The court case of Biete Z-Shape lasted for 5 years and cost over 30 million units of currency. It featured hundreds of witnesses and thousands of pages of information. Throughout the proceedings, the defendant remained mostly silent, her face a mask of indifference. For the relatives of the victims, the case was an exhausting ordeal that forced them to relive their trauma every single day. They had to look at the woman who had helped the men who took their lives. The final judgment in the year 2018 brought a sentence of life imprisonment for Z-Shape, but for many, it felt like a hollow victory. The deeper issues of systemic bias within the security apparatus remained largely unaddressed. Multiple folders related to the informants who were near the group had been shredded by the agency just days after the discovery of the cell. The question of how much the state actually knew remained a haunting specter overall. Today, a memorial stands at the site of the shooting in Nuremberg. It is a simple stone with the names of all 10 victims inscribed upon it. People often leave fresh blossoms there, a fitting tribute to the male who spent his final moments surrounded by them. The tragedy of Enver Simsek is not just his death, but the decade of silence and slander that followed it. It stands as a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest danger comes from the institutions. The transition from the calculated, political violence in Germany to the chaotic, televised desperation in Brazil marks a shift in how the world consumes tragedy. In South America, the tension would not be a mystery solved years later, but a ticking clock watched by millions on their screens. A young man with a heavy past would find himself at the center of a media circus that would eventually expose the raw, violent heart of Rio de Janeiro and its constabulary. The humidity in Rio de Janeiro was thick enough to feel like a physical weight on the afternoon of June 12th in the year 2000. It was a Monday, and for the thousands of people commuting through the Jardim Botanico district, it started as just another sweltering start to the work week. At approximately 2:20 in the afternoon, a public transport vehicle, specifically the number 174 bus, was pulling away from a stop. Inside the cabin, there were several passengers just looking forward to getting home. Among them was a young male named Sandro Rosa do Nascimento. To the other riders, he just looked like a typical 21-year-old in a state of distress. But Sandro was carrying a heavy weight. He was a survivor of a horrific street massacre years earlier. And today, his internal pressure cooker was about to blow its lid in front of the entire nation. Sandro stood up from his seat, reached into his waistband, and pulled out a revolving firearm. He didn't fire it immediately. Instead, he shouted at the operator to stop the engine. The passengers froze. This wasn't a standard robbery. Sandro's eyes were wide, and he seemed to be vibrating with a mixture of terror and fury. Within minutes, the vehicle was surrounded by the local enforcement division, known as the military police of Rio. What followed was a standoff that would last for 4 agonizing hours. But this wasn't happening in private. Because the bus was stalled in a highly visible area, news crews arrived almost instantly. They set up their lenses and began broadcasting the event live. Millions of people across Brazil turned on their sets and watched as a young male held a gun to the heads of terrified women, using them as human shields near the windows. Sandro was performing for the cameras. He would lean out the window, screaming about the injustices he had suffered as a street kid. He wrote messages in lipstick on the glass, telling the world he was going to die. He forced one of the captives to write, "He is going to kill us at 6 on the window pane." The tension was astronomical. The police snipers were in position on the nearby rooftops, but they never received the order to fire. Inside the bus, the atmosphere was a chaotic mix of a hostage crisis and a psychological breakdown. Sandro was vacillating between being aggressive and weeping. He even shared some water with the captives at one point. However, the enforcement officers on the ground were completely disorganized. There was no clear chain of command, and the crowd of onlookers was pressing closer and closer, making it impossible for the tactical units to move. As the clock ticked toward the dusk hours, the situation reached a breaking point. Sandro decided he was going to leave the vehicle. He grabbed a young teacher named Geisa Goncalves, tucked her under his arm as a shield, and stepped onto the pavement. He held his revolver to her side as he moved toward the crowd. This was the moment the authorities had been waiting for, but their execution was a complete and utter catastrophe. An officer from the elite squad stepped out from behind a pillar and attempted to take a close-range shot at Sandro's head, but he flinched. The projectile missed Sandro and struck Geisa in the face. Panic erupted. Sandro, reacting to the noise, fired 3 shots into Geisa's back at point-blank range. The police then swarmed Sandro, wrestling him to the ground while the crowd roared in a mixture of bloodlust and horror. Geisa was rushed to a nearby clinic, but she was declared deceased on arrival. She was only 20 years old. Sandro, however, was still very much alive when the officers threw him into the back of a police van. The cameras captured the vehicle driving away, but they didn't see what happened inside. By the time the van reached the station only a few minutes later, Sandro Rosa do Nascimento was dead. The official cause was asphyxiation. The fallout from the Bus 174 incident was immediate and deafening. It exposed the total lack of training and equipment within the Brazilian security forces. The live broadcast had forced the public to witness a double tragedy: a young woman killed by the very people meant to save her, and a suspect apparently executed in custody. It became a symbol of a broken system where the cycle of violence never truly ends. Sandro's life story was later revealed to be one of constant trauma. As a child, he had watched his own mother be murdered by criminals. He had survived the Candelaria massacre, where police opened fire on sleeping street children. He was a product of the very urban decay he railed against during the hijacking. His death in the back of that van was seen by many as the state finally silencing a voice that had become too inconvenient to hear. The memory of Geisa Goncalves is kept alive by those who see her as an innocent caught in a crossfire of incompetence. The bus itself was eventually removed, but the location remains a somber spot for those who remember the images on their screens. It was a day when the reality of Rio's streets crashed into the living rooms of the middle class, proving that no one is truly insulated from the consequences of a society that forgets its most vulnerable. As the smoke cleared from the streets of Rio, another tragedy involving a young life was about to unfold in the heart of London. This time, the victim was even younger, and the location was not a busy thoroughfare but a quiet residential stairwell. The loss of a 10-year-old boy would spark a nationwide conversation about the safety of children and the shadows that lurk in the corridors of modern urban housing complexes. The revolvers used in the Rio incident were older models, often poorly maintained, which contributed to the erratic nature of the shooting. The temperature during the standoff had remained in the high 20s, making the interior of the bus a literal oven. Sandro had tied a shirt around his face like a mask, which only added to his menacing appearance on the low-resolution television feeds of the era. He was a figure of pure desperation. During the 4 hours of the siege, Sandro had consumed a single bottle of soda that the police had allowed him to have. He spent much of the time pacing the narrow aisle of the bus, his boots clicking on the linoleum floor. The captives, mostly women, were forced to sit on the floor to stay below the window line. One woman, a pharmacy student, later described how Sandro seemed more afraid than they were at certain points. The snipers on the rooftops had a clear line of sight on Sandro dozens of times. They had specialized rifles with high-powered optics. However, the governor of the state and the high-ranking commanders were terrified of the political optics of a public execution on live television. They kept hoping for a peaceful surrender that was never going to come. Their indecision was the primary factor that led to the chaotic finale on the sidewalk. When the elite officer moved in for the shot, he was using a submachine gun on a single-fire setting. The distance was less than 2 feet. The fact that he missed his target and hit the captive is still studied in tactical academies as a prime example of buck fever or extreme stress-induced failure. The officer was later put on trial, but he was eventually acquitted, a verdict that many in the public found difficult to swallow. The van ride that ended Sandro's life lasted less than 10 minutes. There were 5 officers in the back with him. They claimed he was resisting, but the autopsy showed he had been strangled with a degree of force that suggested a deliberate act. The officers were also acquitted in a subsequent trial, leading to claims that the justice system in Brazil was just as skewed as the enforcement branch. The case remains a dark mark. The teacher, Geisa, had been a vibrant part of her community. She was known for her dedication to her students and her bright smile. Her funeral was attended by thousands of people, including many who had watched her final moments on television. It was a moment of national mourning that briefly united a fractured city. But the systemic changes promised in the wake of the crisis were slow to materialize, leaving many to wonder if lessons were learned. The Bus 174 hijacking was more than just a crime. It was a cultural touchstone. It inspired documentaries and films that sought to explain how a boy from the streets could become a monster on a bus. It showed that behind every headline of violence, there is a complex web of history, poverty, and institutional failure. The images of Sandro screaming at the cameras remain some of the most haunting in Brazilian history. In the United Kingdom, the year 2000 would also be defined by the death of a young boy whose journey was just beginning. He was a child of immigrants who believed that London was a land of opportunity and safety. He was walking home from the library, carrying his books and his dreams, when he encountered a group of older boys in a concrete courtyard. His story would become a rallying cry for a generation. The transition from the sweltering heat of Rio to the damp, gray winter of London highlights the universal nature of urban crime. Whether in South America or Europe, the vulnerabilities of the young and the failures of the state to protect them remain a recurring theme. The next story takes us to the Peckham district, where a 10-year-old boy's final walk home would end in a stairwell that would haunt the British consciousness for years. The chill in the southern reaches of the British metropolis was particularly sharp on the 27th afternoon of the 11th month in the year 2000. Damilola Taylor, a boy of 10, was navigating the paved pathways of the Peckham district. He was donned in a distinctive silver-padded jacket that shimmered under the dim street lamps. He was heading back from the local reading facility, his mind likely occupied with his schoolwork and new life. Damilola had only arrived in the United Kingdom a few months prior, moving from Nigeria with his mother. His primary reason for being in London was to support his elder sister, who required specialized clinical attention for a persistent health struggle. The young lad was celebrated for his infectious grin and a spirit that seemed much too large for his slight frame. He was a student at a nearby primary academy and was quickly adapting to his fresh surroundings. The North Peckham estate was a massive complex of concrete dwellings and elevated walkways that felt like a labyrinth to those unfamiliar with the terrain. On this damp Monday, the daylight had already dipped below the horizon by 4 o'clock, casting long, dark silhouettes across the courtyard. Damilola was a diligent pupil, often spending his extra moments at the library to improve his literacy. He was a child who truly believed in the promise of safety. As he walked toward his residence at around 5 o'clock, he was brimming with excitement. He had just finished a computer session and was eager to tell his mother about his progress. He was skipping along the sidewalk, a small figure in a large city, unaware that a group of older youths was lurking near a stairwell. These adolescents were looking for a target, fueled by a senseless desire to exert power through intimidation and random acts of cruelty. The group confronted the boy near a concrete ramp. There was no long conversation or motive of theft. In a flash of chaotic motion, one of the older boys used a broken glass vessel to strike Damilola in the left thigh. It was a singular, swift motion that caused a deep laceration. The attackers, realizing the severity of the wound, or perhaps simply satisfied with their malice, scattered into the darkness of the estate, leaving the 10-year-old alone. Damilola, confused and in sudden agony, tried to continue his journey toward his apartment. He managed to limp for about 40 yards, leaving a trail of vital fluid on the cold pavement. He eventually reached a stairwell landing, where he collapsed against the wall. He was only a short distance from the warmth of his mother's embrace, but the injury had severed a major vessel in his leg. His strength was fading rapidly in the biting winter atmosphere. A passerby discovered the boy a few moments later and immediately raised the alarm. The emergency responders arrived with great speed, but the environment of the estate made it difficult to provide immediate stabilization. Despite the best efforts of the trauma team, Damilola was pronounced departed in the back of the ambulance before he could reach the hospital. The news of the death of an innocent child shocked the entire nation of Great Britain. The subsequent inquiry by the London constables was one of the most extensive in the history of the city. However, it was plagued by difficulties from the start. The estate was a place where residents were often hesitant to speak with officials, fearing retribution from the local gangs. The initial forensic work failed to identify the culprits, and a high-profile trial involving 4 young suspects ended in an acquittal because the evidence was insufficient. For years, the Taylor lineage lived in a state of suspended grief. Damilola's father, Richard, became a vocal advocate for justice, refusing to let his son's memory fade into a cold case file. The case highlighted the deep-seated issues of youth violence and the decay of social structures in the inner cities. It wasn't until the year 2006, through the use of advanced scientific techniques, that a massive breakthrough finally occurred. Technicians revisited the evidence, specifically the silver jacket that Damilola had been wearing on that fateful Monday. Using new methods of fiber analysis, they discovered microscopic traces of blood and textile fragments that linked the boy to 2 brothers, Danny and Ricky Preddy. These 2 individuals had been part of the group on the night of the assault and had managed to evade detection for over 5 years through lies and silence. The Preddy brothers, who were only 12 and 13 at the time of the crime, were finally brought to justice and convicted of manslaughter. The verdict provided a small measure of peace to the Taylor household, but the loss of Damilola remained an open wound. The boy who had come to London seeking a better future had instead become a symbol of the fragility of innocence in an increasingly harsh world. His story changed British law forever. Today, a memorial center in Peckham stands as a tribute to Damilola's life, focusing on providing opportunities for young people to escape the cycle of violence. The concrete walkways where he took his final steps have been demolished and replaced, but the image of a young boy in a silver jacket remains etched in the collective memory of the public. It serves as a reminder that the smallest lives often leave the most significant impact on history. While the streets of London were grappling with the aftermath of the Taylor case, another disappearance was taking place thousands of miles away in the neon-lit heart of Tokyo. This time, the individual was an adult, a British woman who had traveled to Japan for adventure and work. Her sudden absence would spark an international search that would eventually lead to the discovery of a predator hiding in plain sight within the city. The silver jacket that Damilola wore was more than just a piece of clothing. It was his favorite garment, a gift that made him feel special. On the evening of his passing, the temperature had dropped to nearly freezing, and a light mist was beginning to form over the Thames. He had been so proud of his academic achievements that day, having received a positive report from his instructors. He was a child who saw the world as a place of wonder. The broken glass that was used as a tool of violence was a discarded beer bottle, a common sight in the neglected corners of the housing complex. The fact that such a mundane object could end a life so quickly was a point of horror for the public. The wound was specifically 4 inches deep, cutting directly into the femoral artery. In the medical world, this is an injury that requires immediate surgical intervention to prevent a fatal outcome. During the initial phase of the investigation, over 500 statements were taken by the detectives. They spent thousands of hours scouring the estate for the weapon, but it was never recovered. The atmosphere in Peckham was one of intense tension, with many local youths refusing to cooperate. The code of silence was so strong that it took a total of 3 separate trials over several years to finally reach a definitive legal conclusion. Richard Taylor often spoke about the dream his son had of becoming a doctor. Damilola wanted to heal people, a goal inspired by his sister's medical struggles. The irony that he passed away due to a lack of medical assistance on a cold stairwell was a burden that his father carried every single day. The family's journey from Nigeria was supposed to be a path to life, but it ended in a tragedy that redefined urban policing in England. The scientific breakthrough in 2006 involved the discovery of a tiny stain of life fluid on the cuff of one of the suspect's trousers. It was smaller than a grain of rice, but it contained enough genetic material to prove a direct contact with the victim. This piece of information was the final nail in the coffin for the defense team. It proved that the brothers had been standing directly over the boy as he suffered. The Preddy brothers were sentenced to 8 years in a youth detention facility. This sentence was seen as light by some, but for the prosecution, it was a hard-won victory after years of failure. The case led to a total overhaul of how the metropolitan authorities handle crimes involving young offenders and how they gather intelligence within marginalized communities. It was a turning point for the social fabric of the entire London area. The legacy of the case is visible in the way the United Kingdom now monitors blade-related crimes and supports the relatives of victims. Gloria Taylor, Damilola's mother, passed away a few years after the conviction, her heart reportedly broken by the ordeal. Richard continued the work, becoming a knighted figure for his services to the community. He turned his personal agony into a mission to ensure that no other child would meet such an end. As we shift our focus from the concrete estates of South London back to the bustling districts of Japan, we find a story of a young woman named Lucie Blackman. She was a vibrant 21-year-old with a passion for travel who vanished without a trace after a weekend shift. Her journey would take us from the high-end hostess clubs of Roppongi to a dark, seaside cave where the true nature of a serial predator was finally revealed. The initial morning of the 7th period of the millennial transition was marked by a sweltering heat that clung to the glittering towers of the archipelago nation's capital. A lanky, fair-haired Briton named Lucie was navigating her fresh existence in this unfamiliar land. She had previously operated as a member of a cabin crew for an aviation company, but her current path led her to the vibrant nightlife of the Roppongi district during the summer. Her chosen labor was within a high-end social establishment, where young ladies from abroad were paid to provide stimulating dialogue to affluent corporate gentlemen. It was a world of luxury spirits and expensive attire. On that specific weekend, she had arranged a meeting with a repeat visitor who had promised her a scenic excursion to the coastline. She departed from her shared residence with an air of optimism and excitement for the ocean breeze. The individual she was meeting was an enigmatic figure who presented himself as a wealthy property mogul. He had invited her to his private abode overlooking the Pacific waves. However, as the light dipped behind the horizon, the Briton failed to return to her dwelling. Her roommate, becoming increasingly anxious, noticed that the lady's cellular equipment was no longer active. A sense of impending dread began to fill the small living space. Word of the absence reached her relatives back in the United Kingdom within 48 hours. Her patriarch, a man of great resolve named Tim, immediately organized a flight to the East Asian metropolis. He refused to accept the initial theories that his kin had simply decided to go on a spontaneous vacation. He began a massive public awareness campaign, plastering posters across every available surface in the entertainment zone to find her. The local constabulary was initially hesitant to launch a full-scale inquiry, suggesting that the young lady might have just vanished into the underground economy of the hostessing world. But the pressure from the British government and the constant media presence forced them to take a closer look at the records of the gentleman who frequented the club. They eventually identified a suspect who had a history of using chemical agents on young females. This individual was named Joji Obara, a naturalized citizen with a vast fortune and a dark secret life. He owned multiple luxury apartments and spent his time scouring the night spots for potential victims. When the investigators finally secured a warrant to search his premises, they were met with a scene that defied all logic. They discovered a collection of hundreds of video cassettes, each one documenting a horrifying assault on a sleeping woman. The footage revealed that Obara would invite these ladies to his residence, provide them with a beverage laced with a powerful anesthetic, and then record his actions while they were unconscious. Among the victims seen on the tapes was an Australian lady named Carita, who had tragically expired during her ordeal several annual cycles earlier. The sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming, yet there was still no sign of the fair-haired lady who vanished. The quest intensified, focusing on the rugged coastline near one of the suspect's seaside properties. For many weeks, teams of forensic specialists combed through the sand and the undergrowth, looking for any clue of where he might have hidden the remains. It wasn't until the second month of the following cycle that a breakthrough occurred. A group of searchers noticed a small, concealed opening in a rock formation located within a dark cavern. Inside that damp crevice, they made a discovery that would haunt the nation for a long duration. The remains of the young lady were found buried beneath a layer of concrete. The level of cruelty displayed in the concealment was shocking even to the most seasoned officers. It was clear that the predator had gone to extreme lengths to ensure that she would never be found, using the natural geography of the ocean shore to bury his secrets forever. The trial of Joji Obara became a landmark legal battle in the archipelago nation. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, and that there was no direct proof that the suspect had caused the expiration of the Briton. In a stunning initial verdict, he was acquitted of the murder charge, though he was sentenced to life for the numerous other assaults captured on his tapes. The global reaction was one of pure outrage and disbelief. However, the pursuit of justice did not end there. An appeal was launched, and the higher court reviewed the forensic details and the patterns of the suspect's behavior more closely. They concluded that it was impossible for anyone else to have been responsible for the tragedy in the cave. In the cycle of 2008, the original ruling was overturned, and the villain was finally convicted for the death of the lady from the United Kingdom. The legacy of the Blackman case led to significant changes in how the authorities monitor the nightlife industry and protect foreign nationals working abroad. It also highlighted the dangers of the dark side of the entertainment districts that often remain hidden behind the bright lights and glamour. The determination of her relatives to find the truth became a testament to the power of love and the refusal to let a loved one be forgotten. Looking back at the early phases of the quest, the patriarch often recalled the feeling of walking through the crowded plazas of the urban center, clutching a photograph of his offspring. He spent his days speaking to anyone who would listen, from local shopkeepers to high-ranking diplomats. He even offered a substantial monetary prize for any information that could lead to her location. He was a man possessed by a single goal of finding her. The suspect, Obara, was a master of manipulation who had managed to evade the law for decades. He used his wealth to buy silence and to maintain a facade of respectability in the business world. His private residences were filled with expensive art and high-tech equipment, but they were also chambers of horror for the women he lured there. He was a predator who viewed other human beings as mere objects for his twisted gratification and his tapes. One of the most chilling aspects of the forensic investigation was the discovery of a diary belonging to the villain. In its pages, he had meticulously recorded his thoughts on the various chemicals he used to induce sleep in his targets. He experimented with different dosages and methods of administration, treating his crimes like a scientific endeavor. This cold, clinical approach to violence was a key indicator of his sociopathic nature. The cavern where the remains were eventually located was situated only a few hundred yards from one of Obara's favorite vacation spots. It was a place where he likely felt a sense of total control, surrounded by the crashing waves and the desolate cliffs. The fact that he had returned to this location multiple times while the search was underway showed a level of arrogance that was truly terrifying. He believed he was smarter than the lawmen. When the final conviction was handed down, there was a collective sigh of relief from the international community. But the pain of the loss could never be fully erased. The Briton's story became a cautionary tale for many young travelers who venture into unfamiliar cultures. It served as a stark reminder that even in the safest of nations, there are individuals who inhabit the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike those who are alone. Today, the site where the remains were found is a quiet spot of reflection for those who remember the tragedy. The cavern has been sealed, and the natural beauty of the coastline has returned, but the memory of the fair-haired lady remains a permanent part of the local history. Her life was cut short by a man of pure malice, but her name continues to be a symbol of resilience and the ongoing struggle for justice in a world that can be very dark. The impact of the case extended to the highest levels of the British government, leading to new protocols for how diplomats support relatives of missing citizens. It was a catalyst for a more proactive approach to international crime cooperation. The bond between the two nations was tested by the initial failures of the inquiry, but it eventually led to a stronger partnership in the fight against those who prey on the vulnerable across borders. As the chapters of the Tokyo mystery were finally closing with the predator behind bars for the rest of his natural life, another horrifying saga was reaching its legal conclusion in the mountains of South America. This story would reveal a scale of depravity that was almost impossible to comprehend. It involved a man who had roamed the Andes for years, targeting the most innocent members of society and leaving a trail of sorrow across nations. This individual's actions were not confined to a single urban center or a specific night spot, but were part of a methodical and terrifying campaign of violence that spanned an entire decade. The world was about to learn the name of a monster whose tally of victims was so high that it forced a total reassessment of how serial criminals are tracked and punished. The millennial era was the moment when the true scale of his reign of terror was calculated. The transition from the high-tech urban environment of Japan to the rugged, rural landscapes of Colombia and Ecuador highlights the terrifying reality that monsters can exist in any setting. Whether they are wealthy moguls in luxury apartments or nomadic drifters in the wilderness, their motives and their impact remain the same. The next story takes us to the sentencing of a man known as the Beast of the Andes, whose crimes left a permanent scar. The courtroom in the city of Papian was packed with grieving relatives as the judge prepared to deliver the final word on the fate of this predator. The atmosphere was thick with a mixture of anger and a desperate need for closure. The evidence presented was a catalog of nightmares, detailing the final moments of dozens of young boys who had been lured away by a man they thought was a friend. This was the moment of truth for the justice system. The oxygen in the elevated terrain of the southern Colombian peaks felt incredibly scarce during the first month of the fresh epoch. In the municipality of Popayan, a massive assembly of citizens was congregating outside a stone-faced judicial structure. They were not gathered for a celebration of the calendar flip. They were there to look upon the face of a monster who had turned the lush valleys of the Andes into a sprawling, hidden cemetery for the innocent. Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos was a male of unremarkable stature and plain features. He often wore thick-rimmed spectacles and maintained a soft-spoken, almost timid delivery that allowed him to drift through the bustling plazas of South America like a ghost. But behind that masquerade of anonymity lived a predatory urge that was unmatched in the entire record of human depravity. For over a decade, he had roamed the rural paths and the vibrant markets. The transition into the year 2000 was the moment when the global community finally grasped the full magnitude of what this man had done. While he had been apprehended in late 1999, the following January was defined by his systematic unraveling. Sitting across from specialized investigators, the male began to speak with a chilling lack of emotion. He pulled out a collection of maps and began to mark locations with a black felt-tip pen. Each tiny ink dot represented a young male between the ages of 8 and 16. These were the children of the displaced, the shoe shiners, the orphans of the coffee plantations, and the street beggars who had no one to look for them. Garavito explained how he would employ various disguises to earn their confidence. Sometimes he would dress as a holy monk, other times as a weary disabled traveler, or perhaps a generous street merchant with sweets and coins. He would lead these youngsters away from the safety of the crowds, promising them a small amount of currency or a job opportunity in the nearby woods. Once they were isolated within the deep ravines or the tall grass of the mountainside, the predator would reveal his true nature. The details of the rituals he performed before taking their lives were so gruesome that even the seasoned officials in the room had to step outside to regain their composure. By the middle of the sentencing phase in Papayan, the monster had formally admitted to the execution of over 140 young victims. However, the authorities suspected the actual number was well over 300, spanning across Colombia and into neighboring Ecuador. The scale of the tragedy was so immense that it felt impossible to process. Entire villages had lost a generation of their youth to a man they thought was a harmless, roaming nomad. The atmosphere in the courtroom turned from shock to white-hot fury as the legal limitations of the era became clear. According to the statutes in place at that time, The maximum period of incarceration allowed for any offender was only 30 years. Because the laws did not allow for consecutive sentences for multiple crimes, the man who had stolen hundreds of lives was facing a term that seemed like a slap in the face to the grieving parents and the public. Mothers stood in the aisles, clutching faded photographs of their offspring, screaming for a harsher penalty. They couldn't understand how a system meant to protect them could offer such a light resolution for the most prolific serial offender in the history of the continent. The outrage sparked a national debate about legislative reform and the need for life sentences. It was a moment of profound crisis for the Justice Department of the Republic of Colombia. As the judge read out the final word, the monster sat there with his head bowed, occasionally wiping his eyes in what many believed was a staged display of remorse. He was sentenced to the maximum of 30 years, which was later reduced even further because he had cooperated with the inquiry and pointed out the locations of the hidden graves. The idea that he could potentially walk free while still in his prime years sent a shiver through the entire population. The year 2000 became the anchor for this collective trauma. It was the point where the secrets of the Andes were unearthed, quite literally. Excavation teams spent months following the marks on the male's map, finding small sets of bones in the most desolate corners of the highlands. Each discovery was a fresh wound for a nation already struggling with internal conflict and poverty. The beast of the Andes had exploited the chaos of the country. The legacy of the Garavito proceedings changed the way children are monitored in the region. It led to the creation of new registries and a more proactive approach to finding missing youth. But for the families in the peaks of Popayan, the scars were permanent. They had to live with the knowledge that a predator had been in their midst for years, hiding behind a religious habit or a salesman's grin, preying on the very kindness that defined their culture. The nomadic nature of his crimes meant that many of the victims were never formally identified. They were just names on a list of the forgotten, boys who had vanished into the mist of the mountains. The monster's ability to move between jurisdictions without detection highlighted the desperate need for better communication between the various branches of the enforcement units. The year 2000 was a harsh teacher for the authorities of the Andes. In the decades following the sentencing, the male remained behind heavy bars, but the fear of his potential release never truly faded. He became a figure of dark legend, a warning used by parents to keep their youngsters close to the hearth. His story is a testament to the fact that the most dangerous individuals are often the ones who appear the most ordinary, utilizing the trust of the community to facilitate their most heinous and violent impulses. The investigation into the beast of the Andes was a grueling marathon for the forensic specialists. They had to endure the thin air and the rugged terrain of the high altitude while meticulously documenting each site. The items found with the remains were heartbreaking. A single worn shoe, a small toy car, or a piece of a school uniform. These mundane objects were the only things left of lives that had been snuffed out in the darkness of the ravines. During the interviews, the offender would often speak in a detached, clinical manner, as if he were discussing a ledger of transactions rather than human beings. He had a photographic memory for the geography of his crimes, able to recall the exact tree or rock where he had left a victim years earlier. This level of total recall was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his personality. He had carried the maps of his depravity in his mind for a decade. The public outcry eventually led to the passage of Garavito's law, which toughened the penalties for crimes against minors. It was a small victory born of massive sorrow. The nation vowed to never let such a predator operate with such freedom again. But the memory of the early days of the millennium, when the full extent of the horror was first revealed to the world, remains a dark chapter that the people of Colombia can never fully put behind them. As we move from the high, cold peaks of South America to the rolling plains of northern France, we find another instance where a single violent act would lead to a much larger revelation. This time, the location was a quiet parking area in the city of Ambience, and the victim was a woman whose life was taken in a manner that suggested a ritualistic level of cruelty. The search for her killer would eventually use new tools to bridge the gap of time. This next case involves a woman named Lucie, whose discovery in the middle of the year 2000 would ignite an inquiry that spanned several cold cases. It would reveal a predator whose history of violence was hidden beneath the surface of the French legal system. The tools of science were evolving, and they were about to catch up with a man who thought he had outrun his past in the quiet corners of the Picardy region of the country. The transition from the mass scale of the Colombian tragedy to the specific, brutal focus of the French inquiry highlights the universal struggle to track repeat offenders. Whether in the vast Andes or the urban centers of Europe, the ability of a predator to strike and then blend back into the environment is a recurring nightmare for the authorities. The story of Jacquy Haddouche and his final victim is a chilling example of this reality in the year 2000. The parking lot in Ambience was a mundane setting for such a horrific event. It was a place of everyday activity that was suddenly transformed into a crime scene that would haunt the local community for years. The evidence left behind was minimal, but it contained a secret code that only the latest advancements in genetic sequencing could unlock. The hunt was on, and the shadow of the vampire of Picardy was finally about to be brought into the light. The moon was nearly obscured by thick gray clouds over the northern French plains in the middle of the 5th month of the year 2000. In the historic city of Amiens, a 40-year-old woman named Lucie was ending her evening shift. She was a person of routine and kindness, known by her co-workers for her punctuality and her gentle demeanor. As she stepped out into the cool midnight air, she was focused only on the short trek to her parked automobile. The parking area was located near the city's heart, a space that was usually occupied by the vehicles of theater-goers and diners. However, at this late hour, the pavement was mostly deserted. The yellow glow of the street lamps cast long, distorted silhouettes across the asphalt. Lucie reached into her satchel for her keys, the metallic jingle the only sound in the stillness. She was unaware that a predator was crouching in the gap between two large delivery vans. This individual was a man named Jacquy Haddouche. He was a drifter with a lengthy history of violence that the local authorities had failed to properly track. He had been released from a detention center only a short time prior and was already seeking a new outlet for his dark impulses. As Lucie approached her vehicle, the man lunged from the shadows. There was no demand for her purse or her jewelry. This was a sudden, overwhelming eruption of pure malice. The struggle was brief, but incredibly intense. Lucie tried to scream, but a heavy hand was pressed over her mouth. The attacker utilized a sharp implement to inflict a series of devastating wounds. Once the victim was no longer able to resist, the man's behavior turned from aggressive to ritualistic. He didn't just end her life. He began to mutilate the body in a way that suggested a deep-seated hatred for the living. It was a scene of absolute depravity. Before departing the area, the culprit attempted to destroy any trace of his presence. He used a flammable liquid to set a portion of the scene ablaze. The orange flickers of the fire danced against the concrete walls of the nearby buildings, eventually catching the attention of a late-night security patrol. When the responders arrived and extinguished the flames, they were met with a macabre sight that would leave a permanent mark on the collective memory of Picardy. The investigators from the regional gendarmerie were initially baffled. The level of violence was extreme, even for a homicide. There were no obvious connections between the victim and any known criminals in the district. Lucie had no enemies and no debts. She was a random target of a man who viewed the world as his hunting ground. The only clue left behind was a small amount of genetic material that had survived the heat of the fire on a piece of discarded fabric. At this point in the year 2000, the science of genetic profiling was undergoing a massive revolution. The French authorities were beginning to populate a national database with the biological signatures of violent offenders. They took the sample from the Amiens scene and ran it through the system. For several weeks, there was no match. But as more individuals were processed through the courts, a hit finally registered on the computer monitors of the lab. The sample belonged to Jacquy Haddouche. He had been picked up on a minor charge in a different department, and his profile had finally been uploaded. When the detectives looked into his background, they were horrified by what they found. Haddouche had been a shadow in the system for decades, moving from city to city, leaving behind a trail of victims that had never been linked. He was a man who thrived on the lack of communication between local precincts. The discovery of his link to Lucie was just the beginning. The forensic team began to compare his biological signature to dozens of cold cases across the country. They found a match for a murder in 1992 and another from 1995. It became clear that the man they had caught in Amiens was a serial predator who had been operating with total impunity. He was a ghost who had finally been trapped by the very blood he spilled. During the subsequent interviews, Haddouche was defiant. He refused to admit to the crimes, even when faced with the undeniable proof of his own DNA. He sat in the interrogation room with a look of smug indifference, a man who believed he was superior to the laws of the Republic. However, the evidence from the parking lot in Ambience was overwhelming. The specific type of mutilation and the use of fire were signatures that he had utilized in previous attacks. The trial took place in a courtroom filled with the relatives of his many victims. The atmosphere was one of heavy sorrow and a desperate need for a final resolution. The prosecution presented a timeline of his movements, showing how he had utilized the railways and the cheap hostels of northern France to stay one step ahead of the law. He was a nomadic killer who took advantage of the vulnerability of women who were simply going about their daily lives. The judgment was swift and absolute. Haddouche was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for a long duration. The conviction brought a sense of closure to the people of Amiens, but it also exposed the deep cracks in the judicial system. It was a wake-up call for the government to invest more in forensic technology and to ensure that violent offenders were monitored more closely after their release from the correctional facilities. The case of Lucie Gerard became a landmark in French criminology. It proved that no matter how much a killer tries to hide their tracks, the invisible traces they leave behind will eventually catch up to them. The use of fire, intended to destroy the evidence, had instead preserved the very thing that led to the culprit's undoing. It was a poetic form of justice for a woman whose life was taken in such a brutal and senseless manner in the darkness. Today, the parking lot in Amiens is a different place, with better lighting and increased surveillance. But for those who lived through the year 2000, it remains a site of a great tragedy. The memory of the woman who was just trying to get to her car is a reminder of the fragility of safety. The shadow of the man who lurked in the gap between the vans has been removed from the streets, but the lessons of the case remain vital. The transition from the rugged mountains of the Andes to the urban centers of France shows that the nature of the predator is universal. Whether they are roaming the high altitudes or the city streets, they utilize the same tactics of isolation and surprise. The year 2000 was a turning point for the authorities in both nations, as they began to utilize new methods to track and identify those who prey on the most vulnerable members of society. As we leave the damp plains of Picardy, we travel across the Atlantic to the vibrant city of Guadalajara in Mexico. Here, the violence was not a sudden explosion in a parking lot, but a slow, calculated process that took place behind the closed doors of high society villas. This story involves a woman who used her charm and her social standing to hide a series of murders that were motivated by greed rather than a primal urge for blood. The next case features a woman known as the Black Widow of Guadalajara. She was a figure of elegance and wealth, a staple of the local charity circuit, who seemed to have a string of tragic luck with her partners. But in the year 2000, the true cause of her husband's sudden health failures was finally revealed. It involved a common household chemical and a web of deceit that had allowed her to prosper for years without any suspicion. The transition from the visceral, external violence of Haddouche to the internal, chemical warfare of the Mexican widow highlights the different ways that a predator can operate. One uses a knife in a parking lot, the other uses a cocktail in a dining room. Both leave a trail of departed souls, and both believe they are untouchable. The year 2000 would be the moment when the masks for both of these individuals were finally stripped away. In the sun-drenched avenues of Mexico, the authorities were about to uncover a scandal that would rock the upper echelons of society. It began with the sudden passing of a wealthy businessman and ended with the arrest of a woman who had turned the act of mourning into a professional career. The science of toxicology would play the same role in Guadalajara that the science of genetics played in Amiens, bridging the gap between suspicion and truth. The oppressive humidity of the Jalisco highlands during the 8th month of the year, 2000, was usually balanced by the cool breezes that swept through the gardens of the wealthy elite. In the city of Guadalajara, a woman named Maria de Jesus Gonzalez was known for her impeccable taste and her frequent presence at the most exclusive social gatherings. She was a figure of grace and poise, often seen draped in expensive silks and adorned with rare jewels. Her third husband, a prominent businessman named Enrique, had recently begun to suffer from a series of mysterious health ailments. It started with simple bouts of nausea and dizziness, which the local clinic initially attributed to the stress of his massive corporate expansion. However, as the weeks progressed, Enrique's condition took a sharp turn for the worse. He complained of a strange, cloying sweetness in the back of his throat after his evening drinks. Maria was a picture of devotion throughout this ordeal. She was constantly at his bedside, smoothing his brow and offering him chilled beverages to help with the heat. She was the one who insisted on the most expensive private care, yet despite the interventions of top specialists, Enrique's kidneys began to fail in a rapid and unexplained manner. The doctors were puzzled by the speed of the decline in a man who had previously been the picture of vitality. The villa in which they resided was a sprawling monument to success, featuring marble fountains and a staff of 12. But behind the ornate doors, a much darker operation was in progress. Maria was not just a grieving partner. She was a meticulous architect of her own fortune. She had spent years cultivating relationships with local officials and insurers, ensuring that every aspect of her financial security was tied to the well-being of her wealthy mates. As Enrique lay in his clinical bed, drifting in and out of consciousness, the medical staff noticed something peculiar. Whenever Maria brought him his favorite fortified juice, his symptoms would spike. A young resident at the facility began to grow suspicious of the chemical odor that seemed to emanate from the patient's breath. It was a faint, syrupy scent that didn't match any of the prescribed treatments. This was the first crack in her sophisticated facade. An internal inquiry was launched by the hospital's toxicological unit. They performed a specialized screening of the patient's metabolic levels and found a massive concentration of ethylene glycol. This substance is the primary component of automotive antifreeze, a liquid designed to lower the freezing point of engines. In humans, it acts as a lethal toxin that crystallizes within the renal system, effectively shredding the internal organs from the inside out. The agents of the Mexican Federal Branch were quietly notified of the findings. They began to dig into Maria's background and were stunned by the patterns they uncovered. It turned out that Enrique was not the first of her companions to suffer a sudden and catastrophic medical event. Her previous two partners, both of whom were men of significant means, had also passed away from what were then described as natural causes related to heart and liver issues. The first husband had been a wealthy rancher who owned thousands of acres of prime land. He had died only 2 years into their marriage. The second was a high-profile attorney who specialized in international trade. He had lasted less than 18 months. In both cases, Maria had been the sole beneficiary of massive life insurance policies and sprawling estates. She had utilized her charm and her social status to bypass any serious forensic scrutiny in those past eras. Investigation into the earlier deaths revealed a web of bribery and intimidation. Maria had paid off local coroners to sign death certificates without performing autopsies, citing the family's desire for a quick and private burial. She had essentially bought the silence of the state, allowing her to move from one fortune to the next, with the grace of a socialite and the coldness of a professional assassin. She was a master of the long game of accumulation. In August of the year 2000, the authorities decided to strike. They secured a search warrant for the Gonzalez mansion and discovered several containers of industrial-grade antifreeze hidden in a locked cabinet within the pantry. They also found a collection of forged documents and ledger books that detailed the various insurance payouts she had received over the last decade. The evidence was overwhelming, stripping away her mask of high society elegance. When the agents entered the villa to place her under arrest, Maria was hosting a small brunch for the local charity committee. She greeted the officers with a look of mild annoyance, as if they were merely late guests to her party. But as the handcuffs were placed on her slender wrists, her composure finally shattered. She began to scream about her influence and her connections, promising that she would have every one of them dismissed from their posts. The subsequent trial was a sensation in Guadalajara, exposing the dark undercurrents of the city's upper class. Prosecutors presented the medical records and the toxicological reports, showing how she had carefully titrated the doses of poison to mimic the symptoms of a natural illness. She had been feeding her husband the toxic cocktail for months, watching him wither away while she planned her next move. The level of premeditation was truly chilling. During the testimony, several former staff members came forward to describe the bizarre behavior they had witnessed. One maid recalled seeing Maria mixing a neon green liquid into Enrique's morning pitcher, claiming it was a special herbal supplement from the mountains. Another described how Maria would spend hours in the library, researching the effects of various chemicals on the human body. She was a self-taught expert in the art of the silent kill. The defense tried to argue that Enrique had been depressed and had ingested the substance himself, but the medical evidence of chronic, small-dose exposure made that theory impossible. No one survives such a high concentration for that long without someone else administering it. The jury saw through the lies and the theatrical displays of grief. Maria de Jesus Gonzalez was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree homicide and insurance fraud. The sentencing was a moment of reckoning for the community. The woman who had been a pillar of the social scene was sentenced to the maximum term allowed by the laws of Jalisco. Her vast wealth was seized and used to pay restitution to the families of her previous victims. The Black Widow of Guadalajara had finally been caught in the very web of greed and deceit she had spent her entire adult life spinning with such careful, lethal precision. The legacy of the case led to a massive overhaul of how the Mexican insurance industry handles large payouts and how the state monitors the actions of private coroners. It highlighted the fact that wealth and status can often act as a shield for the most heinous individuals. The memory of the three men who thought they had found love, only to find a slow and agonizing end, serves as a cautionary tale about the true cost of blind ambition. Today, the mansion where Maria once reigned is a silent shell, its marble fountains dry and its gardens overgrown. The social circles she once dominated have moved on, their members hesitant to speak her name. The case remains a landmark in Mexican criminal history, a story of a woman who chose to trade human lives for a life of luxury, only to end her days in a stark, concrete cell far away from the silk dresses and the glittering jewels of her past. The transition from the calculated, chemical betrayal in the villas of Mexico to the erratic, religious violence on the American railways highlights the diverse nature of crime in the year 2000. While Maria was a stationary predator, our next individual was a nomad who used the vast network of the United States freight system to become a ghost. He was a man who believed he was on a divine mission, leaving a trail of blood across the heartland. This male was known as the Railway Killer, and his sentencing in the middle of the year 2000 would bring an end to a cross-country manhunt that had paralyzed the nation. He didn't use slow-acting poisons or high society charm. He used the blunt force of whatever tools he could find at his crime scenes. He was a man of the shadows who moved between states on the backs of steel giants, evading the authorities with ease. The year 2000 was the point where the justice system finally caught up with this drifter, bringing him from the tracks to the death chamber. The story of Angel Maturino Resendiz is a catalog of surreal arrangements and brutal encounters that challenged the limits of border security and interstate communication. He was a predator who found his victims in the quiet homes near the tracks, appearing out of the night and vanishing just as quickly. As the judge in Houston prepared to deliver the final word, the nation watched to see if the man who had haunted the rails for so long would finally face the ultimate penalty. The evidence was a haunting collection of personal items and religious symbols left at the scenes of his many crimes. This was the moment when the tracks finally led to a dead end, and the shadow of the train-hopping slayer was permanently cast into the light of justice. The steel rails that crisscrossed the heart of Texas were vibrating with the rhythmic pulse of a massive freight locomotive in the late hours of a winter evening. In the affluent enclave of West University Place, Dr. Claudia Benton was winding down after a long shift at the medical facility. She was a brilliant neurologist, 44 years of age, who had dedicated her life to understanding the complexities of the human brain and helping those in need. Her residence was situated just a few hundred paces from a major rail artery, a location she had chosen for its convenience and its quiet charm. The low rumble of the passing locomotives was a sound she had grown accustomed to, a white noise that usually lulled her into a sense of security. But on this specific evening, a male was stepping off a slow-moving grain car, his eyes fixed on the lights of the elegant houses that bordered the tracks. This individual was Angel Maturino Resendiz, a man whose existence was a phantom in the eyes of the law. He had crossed the international boundary dozens of times, utilizing the complex network of iron paths to navigate the continent like a predator in a jungle. He believed he was an instrument of a higher power, a nomadic traveler who was destined to leave a mark on those who lived in comfort while he roamed in the grit and the grease of the yards. As the neurologist sat in her living area, perhaps reading a journal or planning her next lecture, she was unaware that the glass slider at the rear of her property had been breached. Resendiz moved with the practiced stealth of a man who had spent decades living in the darkness of the transit hubs. He didn't carry a firearm. He preferred the intimacy of whatever heavy objects the environment provided to finish his grim and terrifying assignments. The encounter was swift and marked by a level of savagery that would later stun the forensic specialists. Resendiz utilized a heavy bronze statue from the victim's own collection to deliver the fatal blows. But what happened after the physical conflict was what truly separated this offender from a typical burglar. Instead of fleeing with the valuables, he spent several hours inside the dwelling, meticulously organizing the victim's personal possessions. He covered the form with a quilt and placed a small religious icon near her head in a precise manner. He went into the pantry area and prepared a meal, consuming it slowly while the neurologist lay still only a few feet away. He then gathered a few items of jewelry and the keys to her luxury transport, but he didn't head for the coast. He drove the motor to a parking area near another set of tracks, abandoned it, and hopped onto the next outbound train. This pattern was repeated across several states, from Illinois to Kentucky to the Deep South. Resendiz became the subject of one of the most intense manhunts in the history of the Federal Bureau. He was placed on the list of the 10 most wanted fugitives, but he remained elusive, a ghost on the rails who could vanish into a boxcar and be 500 miles away by dawn. The tracks were his veins, and the heavy machines were his heartbeat and pulse. The fear that gripped the nation was palpable. People living near the rail lines began to fortify their dwellings, installing heavy bolts and floodlights to ward off the shadow that moved with the steel. The authorities were struggling with the lack of communication between the various jurisdictions and the ease with which the suspect could bypass the border checkpoints. It was a failure of the system that allowed a monster to roam through the heartland. In July of 1999, the hunt finally reached a dramatic conclusion on a bridge connecting Texas to the Southern Republic. Through the negotiation efforts of his relative and a courageous ranger, Resendiz agreed to surrender. He walked across the span of the international bridge with his hands raised, a tired and disheveled male who looked more like a weary traveler than a prolific slayer of 15 or more innocent and precious souls. The legal proceedings in Houston during the month of May in the year 2000 were the culmination of this dark journey. The courtroom was packed with the relatives of his victims, individuals whose lives had been shattered by the sudden and brutal arrival of the stranger from the tracks. They listened as the details of the neurologist's final moments were recounted, the air in the room thick with a mixture of profound grief and mounting anger. Resendiz sat at the defense table, his gaze often wandering toward the ceiling as if he were listening to voices that no one else could hear. He claimed that he was a soldier in a spiritual war, and that his actions were directed by a divine authority. This surreal defense did little to sway the jury, who were presented with the overwhelming physical evidence linking him to the various scenes across the vast heartland of the United States of America. One specific detail that chilled the investigators was the fact that Resendiz had taken the time to wash himself in the victim's shower after the act. He had used her soap and towels, a level of casual occupation that suggested he felt a sense of entitlement to her space. He also sorted through her mail, looking for cash or checks, and neatly stacked the envelopes on the kitchen counter. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a cold occupation of a life. The defense attorneys tried to present a history of childhood trauma and mental instability, hoping to avoid the ultimate penalty. They spoke of his upbringing in a small village and the hardships he faced as a youth. But the prosecution countered with the sheer number of victims and the calculated nature of his evasion. He wasn't a man who didn't know right from wrong. He was a man who chose to do wrong and used his intelligence to hide for years. The most haunting part of the testimony involved the ritualistic arrangements he left behind. In one house, he had placed the victim's shoes in a neat row, pointing toward the door. In another, he had stacked texts in a precise pyramid. These signatures were the hallmarks of a mind that was profoundly fractured, yet capable of a terrifying level of focus. He was a predator who sought to bring a perverted sense of order to his internal and external chaos. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict that the public had been demanding for months. Angel Maturino Resendiz was found guilty of the capital murder of Dr. Claudia Benton. The sentencing phase that followed was equally intense, as the prosecution argued that the only appropriate penalty for such a widespread and cruel spree was the ultimate one. The male was sentenced to the death chamber by means of lethal injection. As the judge pronounced the sentence, a silence fell over the gallery. The man who had used the railways to evade the law for so long was finally at the end of the line. The case led to significant changes in how the Border Patrol monitors the freight yards and how the federal agencies share intelligence regarding nomadic offenders. It was a hard-learned lesson about the vulnerabilities of a nation that relies so heavily on its massive iron infrastructure. For the Benton family, the sentencing provided a measure of justice, but it could not replace the brilliant mind that had been snuffed out in a single moment of violence. The neurologist's legacy continues through the work of her colleagues, but her name will forever be associated with the terror that rode the rails at the turn of the century. The shadow of the locomotive remains a reminder of the darkness that can step off a train in the night. Resendiz remained on death row for several more years as his appeals moved through the higher courts. He continued to speak of his delusions, becoming a figure of intense study for forensic psychologists who sought to understand the roots of his depravity. He was eventually executed in the year 2006. His final words, a plea for forgiveness from the families of those he had taken from the world during his long and bloody journey. The tracks near West University Place still hum with the passage of the freight cars, but the residents now look toward the steel lines with a different level of awareness. The era of the railway killer left a permanent mark on the American psyche, a story of how a single male with a twisted mission could turn the backbone of commerce into a corridor of death. The justice served in Houston was the final stop for a train that should never have run. The transition from the steel tracks of Texas to the vast rural landscapes of the Far East highlights the global reach of the serial predator. While Resendiz was a nomadic phantom of the rails, our next story takes us to the Jilin province of China, where a group of individuals used a very different method of deception to lure their victims. They didn't ride the trains, they used the promise of a better life to lead people to their ultimate doom. This case involved the Baicheng serial killings, a discovery made in the latter half of the year 2000 that exposed a horrifying trend in the rapidly developing nation. It involved the luring of migrant workers to remote locations under the guise of employment opportunities. These individuals, seeking to provide for their kin in the booming economy, instead found themselves in the hands of opportunistic slayers who valued their few possessions. The investigation was conducted in a state of extreme secrecy, as the authorities sought to prevent a social panic during a period of significant national transition. The story of the Baicheng victims is a testament to the risks faced by the floating population of workers who form the backbone of modern urbanization. It is a tale of how greed can turn the hope of a new beginning into a final, silent ending in the desolate outskirts of the city. The discovery of the hidden graves in Jilin was a moment of profound shock for the local community, revealing a scale of violence that had been hidden beneath the surface of the bustling job markets. The culprits were men who understood the desperation of the migrants, and they used that knowledge to facilitate a series of murders that went unnoticed for months. The justice that followed was swift and absolute, mirroring the harshness of the crime. As we move from the death row chambers of Texas to the silent execution grounds of China, we see that the motives of the predator remain remarkably consistent across cultures. Whether driven by a perverted sense of religion or a cold, calculated desire for profit, the impact on the victims and their families is a universal language of sorrow. The year 2000 was a period of reckoning for those who thought they could operate in the shadows. The industrial landscape of the Jilin province was a sprawling canvas of gray concrete and rusted iron as the final seasons of the era of 1900 drew to a close. In the municipality of Baicheng, the transition into the modern age was marked by a frantic energy and a massive influx of rural laborers seeking their piece of the economic boom. These were people who possessed little more than the sturdy garments on their backs and a burning desire for work. The transit depot in Baicheng was a chaotic center where the pulse of the nation was most visible. Every hour, hundreds of newcomers stepped off the passenger coaches, blinking in the harsh light of the plaza, clutching their woven sacks and scanning the horizon for opportunity. They were the floating population, a group of vulnerable souls who had severed their ties to the tilled earth in exchange for the promise of a wage that could sustain their elderly folk. Among the throngs of legitimate recruiters and foremen, a small group of males moved with a predatory grace. They didn't wear the uniforms of the state-owned factories or the badges of the construction firms. Instead, they wore friendly expressions and spoke in the familiar dialects of the countryside. They approached the solitary travelers, the ones who looked the most exhausted and desperate, and offered them a position that seemed too good to be true. The offer was always simple: a high-paying role at a remote brick kiln or a timber yard located just outside the municipal limits. They promised free lodging, daily rations, and a starting bonus that would take a farmer months to earn in the fields. To a man who had spent his last few coins on a one-way ticket to the city, this sounded like the hand of fate reaching down to pull him out of the gutter. They eagerly accepted the invitation without a second thought. The journey to the supposed job site usually involved a long trek into the desolate outskirts of Baicheng, where the urban sprawl gave way to frozen marshes and dense thickets of birch. The perpetrators would lead their marks along winding paths, talking about the bright future that awaited them. They were masters of psychological manipulation, ensuring that the victims felt a sense of gratitude and camaraderie before the final trap was eventually sprung. Once they reached a sufficiently isolated clearing, the mood would shift with a terrifying suddenness. The recruiters would drop their helpful personas and reveal the crude implements they had hidden beneath their coats. They weren't looking for laborers. They were looking for the meager savings and personal identification papers that every migrant carried in a hidden pouch. The violence was swift, brutal, and calculated to ensure that there would be no survivors. After the elimination of the victim, the group would meticulously strip the form of anything that could be traced back to a specific identity. They buried the remains in shallow excavations within the frozen ground, confident that the sheer volume of missing persons in the region would mask their activities. Because these workers had no permanent address and few local connections, their sudden absence was rarely reported to the uniformed units in the city. This cycle of luring and liquidation continued throughout the middle of the year 2000, with the count of the departed rising steadily as the perpetrators grew more arrogant. They began to target multiple victims at once, believing that their remote slaughterhouse was invisible to the eyes of the law. However, the accumulation of so many vanished laborers eventually caught the attention of the high-ranking officials in the provincial capital. A specialized task force was assembled to investigate the rumors of a black hole for migrants near Baicheng. They operated in total secrecy, wearing civilian attire and mingling with the crowds at the depot. They listened to the whispers of the laborers and began to map the locations where individuals had last been seen in the company of the fake recruiters. It was a painstaking process of elimination that required a deep understanding of the local slang. The breakthrough occurred when a young man managed to escape an attempted abduction and provided a detailed description of the suspects. The authorities didn't launch a public manhunt. They wanted to catch the entire group in the act to ensure that the evidence was undeniable. They set up a sting operation, using an undercover agent who posed as a wealthy traveler with a large trunk of goods. They waited in the shadows of the depot for the sharks. The perpetrators took the bait, approaching the agent with the same script of a high-paying job in the woods. As they led him toward their secluded killing field, they were unaware that dozens of armed officers were trailing them through the brush. When the group prepared to strike, the task force moved in with overwhelming force. The struggle was brief, and the suspects were quickly neutralized and transported to a high-security detention facility. The subsequent interrogation revealed the true scale of the depravity. The men confessed to the termination of over 27 victims during that single calendar cycle. They led the investigators to the various burial sites, where the grim task of unearthing the remains began in the biting cold. The sight of so many shallow graves in such a small area was a shock even to the most battle-hardened veterans of the Provincial Security Bureau. The state decided to keep the details of the case under a tight lid of censorship. They feared that the news of a serial slaughter targeting the nation's labor force would cause a massive social panic and disrupt the economic momentum of the new millennium. The trial was held behind closed doors, away from the prying eyes of the international press. The evidence was presented with a clinical efficiency, and the verdict was a foregone conclusion. The culprits were sentenced to immediate execution by means of a single projectile to the rear of the cranium, a standard procedure for the most heinous crimes in that jurisdiction. The sentence was carried out only a few days after the judgment was handed down. The men who had turned the promise of a job into a death sentence were themselves removed from the world in a silent, state-sanctioned ceremony in a courtyard far from the bustling plaza. The legacy of the Baicheng incident led to a total overhaul of how the job markets are monitored in northern China. New regulations were implemented to verify the credentials of recruiters, and additional surveillance was placed at the transit hubs to protect the floating population. It was a hard-learned lesson about the vulnerability of those who are caught between the old ways of the farm and the new, unforgiving realities of the modern industrial city. Today, the marshes outside Baicheng are quiet, the birches swaying in the wind over the sites where so many dreams were buried. The names of many of the victims remain unknown, their stories lost in the vast bureaucracy of a changing nation. But for the families who never heard from their sons again, the silence of the year 2000 remains a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind a friendly face and a promise of a better life. As we move from the silent execution grounds of Jilin to the gilded halls of a royal palace in the heart of the Himalayas, we find a story where the violence was not a product of economic desperation, but of ancient traditions and a modern romance that turned lethal. The year 2000 was the point where a hidden pressure cooker of royal expectations and forbidden love began to reach its boiling point behind the closed doors of Kathmandu. This next narrative involves a prince who was the heir to a 1,000-year-old throne, and the secret life he led that would eventually lead to one of the most shocking acts of regicide in the history of the world. While the world looked on at the peaceful images of the mountain kingdom, a storm was brewing in the heart of the crown prince Dipendra. He was a man torn between his duty to his lineage and his devotion to a woman his family refused to accept. The atmosphere within the palace in late 2000 was one of stifling tension, with whispers of an ancient curse and the rattling of heavy weaponry in the private quarters of the heir. It was a countdown to a tragedy that would change the course of a nation's history and leave the world wondering how such a refined setting could become the site of such a primal eruption of violence. The seeds of the massacre were being sown in the dark. This was the quiet phase of the tragedy, a time of secret meetings and mounting substance abuse that would eventually culminate in a night of absolute horror. The prince was moving through the corridors of power like a ghost, his mind a whirlwind of resentment and despair. The people of Nepal had no idea that their future king was preparing a final solution for the conflict that was tearing his heart and his royal household apart from the inside. The crisp, thin atmosphere of the Himalayan heights swirled around the golden pinnacles of Kathmandu as the final months of the era of 1900 drew to a close. In the heart of the capital sat the Narayana Palace, a fortress of tradition and absolute authority that had stood for generations as the center of the Nepalese world. Behind the high walls and guarded gates, a sovereign drama was unfolding that would soon shock the entire global community. The central figure in this escalating tension was the Crown Prince Dipendra, a male who was deeply beloved by the common folk. He was 30 years of age, educated at the prestigious Eton College in England, and was seen as the bridge between the ancient monarchy and the modern world. He was a skilled pilot, a black belt in karate, and a male who seemed destined to lead his nation into the new millennium with a sense of grace and progressive vision. However, by the late autumn of the year 2000, the prince was leading a double life that was rapidly fracturing. While he performed his ceremonial duties with a smile, his private world was a storm of resentment and addiction. He had become increasingly reliant on a potent mixture of heavy whiskey and a specific type of black hashish. This substance abuse was a poorly kept secret among the palace staff, who watched the heir spiral in silence. The primary catalyst for this internal decay was a woman named Devyani Rana. She was the daughter of a prominent politician and a member of a rival aristocratic clan that had a long and bloody history with the royal house. Dipendra was profoundly in love with her and had expressed his desire to make her his queen. But his mother, Queen Aishwarya, was an iron-willed woman who refused to entertain the notion of such a union between the two families. To the queen, the Rana lineage was a threat to the purity of the throne. She had chosen a different bride for her son, a woman who fit the rigid requirements of the royal hierarchy. The conflict between the mother and the son reached a fever pitch in the final months of 2000. Every banquet and every private gathering became a battlefield of words, with the queen threatening to strip Dipendra of his inheritance if he did not abandon his love. Dipendra felt trapped between his duty to the crown and his devotion to Devyani. He began to spend more time locked away in his private wing of the palace, surrounded by a terrifying collection of modern weaponry. He was a known enthusiast of ordnance, and his chambers were filled with various automatic rifles and submachine guns. He spent his dusk hours cleaning and reloading these tools, his mind racing with a mixture of paranoia and mounting fury. The palace was also haunted by an ancient legend, a curse said to have been placed on the dynasty 10 generations earlier. The prophecy suggested that the monarchy would fall after the 10th ruler. King Birendra, Dipendra's father, was indeed the 10th king of that specific line. By late 2000, the whispers of this curse were growing louder in the streets of Kathmandu, adding a layer of supernatural dread to the very real political crisis. Dipendra's behavior became increasingly erratic during the holiday season. He would often disappear for days at a time, only to reappear in a state of total intoxication. He began to stockpile ammunition and specifically requested more advanced tactical gear from the military commanders. Because he was the future king, no one dared to question his motives or suggest that he might be a danger to himself or others. He was the law in that gilded cage. Inside the Narayan walls, the king and queen tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. They hosted massive parties for the elite of Nepal, serving expensive spirits and fine food. But behind the scenes, the king was deeply worried about his son's mental state. He attempted to mediate the dispute between the queen and the prince, but he lacked the resolve to challenge his wife's authority. He was a kind man, but he was passive in the face of the storm. Devyani, meanwhile, was also under immense pressure. She was aware of the hostility coming from the palace and urged Dipendra to remain calm. They communicated through secret messages and clandestine meetings, their romance a fragile flame in a wind of royal disapproval. The prince's obsession with her grew to a point of mania, and he began to view his own relatives as obstacles that needed to be removed for him to find his version of happiness. As the calendar turned toward the end of 2000, a specific incident occurred that many believe was the final breaking point. During a heated argument in the royal drawing room, the queen reportedly insulted Devyani's character in front of several witnesses. Dipendra did not shout or react with violence at that moment. Instead, he simply walked out of the room, a look of cold, hollow clarity in his eyes that terrified those who saw it. He spent the next several weeks in total isolation, refusing to see his friends or advisors. He was heard firing his weapons at the palace range late into the night, the staccato rhythm of the bullets echoing through the quiet gardens. He was practicing his aim, focusing on a target that only he could see. The seeds of the massacre were not just sown in his mind. They were being watered by a constant flow of alcohol and the smoke of his pipe. The atmosphere in Kathmandu during this period was one of expectant silence. The people knew that something was wrong within the royal household, but the palace was a black box. The media was tightly controlled, and the rumors were only shared in the dim light of the tea shops. No one could have imagined that the beloved crown prince was preparing to turn his tactical armory against his own mother, father, and siblings in a single night. This silent phase of the tragedy is perhaps the most haunting part of the story. It was a time when the disaster could have been prevented, if only someone had the courage to speak truth to power. But in a kingdom where the monarch is seen as a living god, the flaws of the prince were hidden behind a veil of reverence. The year 2000 was the last moment of peace for a dynasty that had ruled the mountain peaks for over 2 centuries. The countdown to the massacre of June 2001 was already ticking in the dark corridors of the Narayan. Dipendra had made his choice. He would not be the king who gave up his love. He would be the one who ended the lineage rather than submit to its rules. The golden roofs of the palace reflected the sun, but inside, the light was fading, replaced by the cold glow of a plan that was as methodical as it was absolutely insane. As the royal tragedy in Nepal was brewing in the silence of the palace, thousands of miles away in Germany, another dark plan was taking shape in the digital realm. This story did not involve ancient crowns or royal bloodlines, but a much more modern and disturbing type of connection. It was a search for a partner in a crime that challenged the very boundaries of human consent and the dark potential of the burgeoning internet of the era. In the final month of the year 2000, a man named Armin Maywes was sitting at his computer in a quiet village, typing out an advertisement that would attract a very specific kind of individual. He was not looking for a lover or a business partner, but for someone who wanted to be consumed in a literal sense. The world was about to be introduced to the Cannibal of Rotenburg, and a case that would redefine the limits of the law. The transition from the grand, Shakespearean tragedy of a prince in a palace to the intimate, suburban horror of a man in a German villa highlights the diverse ways that the human mind can fracture. While Dipendra sought to destroy his family to save his love, Maywes sought to consume another human being to satisfy a deep, primal hunger. Both were driven by an internal logic that was completely detached from the reality of the society. The year 2000 was the moment when these two very different, but equally horrifying, paths were being carved out in the dark. In Kathmandu, the prince was cleaning his rifles, while in Rotenburg, the technician was checking his inbox. The world was standing on the edge of a new millennium, unaware of the monsters that were preparing to step into the light from the most unexpected places. The stage was set for the unthinkable. The bridge between these stories is the common thread of a secret life. Just as the people of Nepal had no idea what was happening behind the palace walls, the residents of the quiet German village had no inkling of the macabre experiments taking place in the large house on the hill. The turn of the century was a time of hidden horrors, where the digital and the physical worlds were merging to create new and terrifying forms of human depravity. The chill of the Central European wilderness was settling deep into the timber-frame structures of the Hesse region as the final weeks of the era of 2000 played out. In the tiny hamlet of Wüstefeld, located near the town of Rotenburg, a 39-year-old male named Armin Maywes was living alone in a massive, crumbling manor house. He was a computer technician by trade, a soft-spoken individual who was known to his few acquaintances as a polite and helpful neighbor. The property he occupied was a sprawling, three-story building with over 40 rooms, many of which had been sealed off for decades. After the passing of his domineering mother a few years prior, Armin had become the sole master of this silent estate. He spent his daylight hours working on hardware, but when the dusk arrived, he retreated to his private study. It was here, illuminated by the pale glow of a monitor, that he explored a subculture that defied all logic. Since his youth, Armin had been haunted by a singular, overwhelming urge that he kept hidden from the world. He didn't desire wealth or fame. He wanted to find a companion that he could merge with in a literal, physical sense. This was not a desire born of hatred or malice, but of a profound and twisted loneliness. He believed that by consuming another human being, he could preserve their essence within himself forever, creating a bond that could never be severed. This fixation had its roots in a childhood spent in isolation, where he had invented an imaginary younger brother to keep him company. He would set a place at the table for this phantom sibling and speak to him in the quiet of his bedroom. As he grew into adulthood, the fantasy evolved from a simple need for companionship into a macabre obsession with permanent physical integration. He wanted to absorb someone so completely that they would be a part of him until his final breath. As the calendar progressed into December of 2000, Armin decided to move his search from the realm of imagination into the reality of the digital landscape. He navigated to an internet bulletin board known as the Cannibal Cafe. This was a place where people with extreme fantasies gathered to discuss their thoughts in a sheltered environment. For most, it was a harmless role-playing site, but for the male in Wüstefeld, it was a hunting ground for a volunteer. He sat in his study, listening to the rhythmic screech and hiss of his 56K modem as it connected to the global network. The interface of the forum was primitive, a simple list of text threads on a dark background. He crafted a message with the precision of a business proposal. He stated that he was looking for a well-built male between the ages of 18 and 30 who wished to be slaughtered and then consumed. He didn't use threats or any coercion. He was looking for total and absolute consent. He posted the advertisement under the pseudonym Frankie, and then he sat back to wait. The speed and the volume of the responses he received were both shocking and deeply revealing. Over the next few weeks, Armin exchanged communications with hundreds of individuals from across the globe. Many were merely curious, while others were seeking a brief thrill from a dark conversation. He meticulously filtered through them. He was a patient fisherman in a vast, dark sea of data, looking for a specific type of soul that was ready to vanish from the face of the planet. He developed a specific set of criteria to test the seriousness of his respondents. He would ask them about their motivations and their willingness to travel to his remote location. Most of the candidates faded away when they realized that he was not playing a game. He was looking for a reality that few dared to even imagine. In the final days of that year, a response arrived from a male in Berlin named Bernd Brandes. Bernd was a 43-year-old microchip designer for a major engineering firm. He was a successful professional with a stable life, yet he had been carrying a secret desire for self-destruction that had plagued him for a long time. When he saw the advertisement from the male in Rotenburg, he felt as though he had finally found the answer to his internal struggle. The initial contact between the two was clinical and detailed. They didn't discuss trivial matters, they spoke about the technical aspects of the act. Bernd expressed a profound willingness to go through with the process, providing Armin with the exact type of commitment he had been searching for. They spent hours in chat rooms, discussing the logistics of the journey from the capital to the remote manor in the countryside. It was a meeting of two shattered minds. Bernd described his life in the city as a hollow performance. He lived in a comfortable apartment, held a high-ranking position, and was respected by his peers. But inside, he felt a crushing weight of emptiness that he believed could only be cured by his own annihilation. He had spent years seeking someone who would take him seriously, and in Armin, he found a male who shared his vision of a final, ultimate union. Their connection was forged in the dark. Armin was fascinated by the level of resolve shown by his new acquaintance. He began to prepare the manor for the event, setting up a specialized room on the top floor that he referred to as the killing room. He installed a heavy table, sharpened his tools, and ensured that the area was soundproofed against the quiet of the hamlet. He was a technician, preparing a final experiment, his mind completely detached from the moral weight of the task he was undertaking. He painted the walls of the room a deep, calming blue and arranged several candles to create a serene atmosphere. He wanted the event to be a ritual of mutual respect rather than a crime of violence. He spent his evenings walking through the empty hallways of the 40-room mansion, visualizing the moment when Bernd would arrive. He felt a sense of purpose that had been missing since his mother's departure, a feeling that he was finally fulfilling his destiny. The atmosphere inside the Wustefeld estate during those winter nights was one of mounting anticipation. Armin would walk through the empty corridors, envisioning the moment when he would no longer be alone. He felt a sense of purpose that had been missing since his mother's departure. To him, the act was a form of supreme intimacy, a way to conquer the fear of abandonment that had defined his existence. He was ready to cross a line that few had ever even approached. In Berlin, Bernd was also making his final arrangements. He was tidying his affairs, saying goodbye to his colleagues under the guise of a long vacation, and preparing his mind for the trip to Hesse. He viewed the male in Rotenburg not as a predator, but as a savior who was going to help him achieve his ultimate goal. The two were locked in a macabre dance of mutual destruction, facilitated by the anonymity and the reach of the early 21st century web. He sold his car, gave away his personal effects, and wrote a final letter of intent. He wanted there to be no doubt that he was a willing participant in the events that were about to unfold. He was a man who had decided to exit the world on his own terms, and he had found the perfect partner to facilitate his departure. The level of planning and coordination between the two individuals was a testament to the power of the internet to connect the most fringe minds. The year 2000 concluded with the meeting finally confirmed for the following spring. Armin had found his partner, and the digital link between the manor and the capital was forged in blood and consent. This case would eventually force the German legal system to grapple with questions of morality and the definition of murder when the victim is a willing participant. It was a story that proved the most terrifying monsters are sometimes the ones who ask. As the shadow of the cannibal was growing in the German countryside, another mystery was being rekindled in the rural heart of France. This story did not involve digital pacts or dark manor houses, but a long-standing family feud and a series of anonymous letters that had terrorized a small village for decades. The year 2000 would be the moment when new tools were applied to an old wound, bringing the case of a young boy back into the national spotlight. The transition from the clinical, consensual horror of Rotenburg to the emotional, generational trauma of the Villemin family shows the diverse ways that tragedy can haunt a community. While Maywes was looking toward a dark future, the people of the Volone Valley were being pulled back into a painful past. The tools of forensic science were evolving, and a single postage stamp was about to reveal a secret that a village had been hiding for over 16 annual cycles. The bridge between these events is the relentless pursuit of a truth that many would rather keep buried. Whether it is the truth of a hidden fantasy or the truth of a cold-blooded crime, the arrival of the new millennium brought with it a renewed focus on solving the unsolvable. The final story of this evening takes us back to the gray hills of eastern France, where the ghost of a 4-year-old boy named Gregory was about to be given a voice once again. This final narrative involves a small child who was taken from his front yard while his mother was inside. The case had captivated and divided the nation for years, with accusations flying between relatives and neighbors. In the year 2000, the investigation was reopened, with the hope that DNA technology could finally identify the individual known as the Crow. This mysterious harasser had sent dozens of letters, taunting the family and claiming the child's life. The atmosphere in the village of Lapangis-sur-Vallon was thick with suspicion and a history of resentment that had never truly faded. The reopening of the case was like reopening a deep, jagged scar on the soul of the community. Everyone had a theory, and everyone was a suspect in a web of jealousy and betrayal that spanned decades. The year 2000 was the point where the past and the future of forensic science met to seek justice for the boy in the river. The fog clung to the jagged peaks of the Vosges Mountains in the eastern sector of the French Republic as the final months of the year 1984 began to cool the Vallon Valley. This was a land of timber mills and tight-knit clans where everyone knew the business of their neighbors. In the small commune of Lapangis, a young couple named Jean-Marie and Christine were building a life that was the envy of their many relatives living in the nearby hills. Jean-Marie was a hard-working foreman who had achieved a level of success that was rare for his age. He had a beautiful dwelling, a modern motor, and a 4-year-old youngster named Gregory, who was the light of his existence. But in this isolated valley, success was often viewed through the lens of resentment. Behind the friendly waves and the shared meals, a deep and toxic jealousy was festering within the broader branches of the Villemin household unit. For several annual cycles, the couple had been plagued by a series of anonymous communications from a figure they called the Crow. It began with sinister telephone calls in the middle of the night, where a muffled voice would spout vile insults and describe the daily movements of the household with terrifying accuracy. The caller seemed to know every secret and every vulnerability of the foreman, turning their sanctuary into a place of constant, lurking dread. The harassment then shifted to handwritten notes delivered through the postal service. These letters were filled with a specific kind of venom, mocking Jean-Marie for his promotions and his material possessions. The author claimed to be a member of the clan who had been wronged by the foreman's perceived arrogance. One specific message arrived with a chilling promise of a final reckoning that would strike at the very heart of the young couple's happiness. On the 16th day of the 10th month in 1984, the threats finally manifested into a physical nightmare. It was a Tuesday, and the afternoon air was damp and heavy. Christine was busy inside the residence, while little Gregory was playing in the sandpit just outside the door. He was wearing a small wool cap and a blue jacket. For a few brief moments, the mother's attention was diverted by her chores as the sun began to dip behind the pines. When she stepped back outside to check on the youngster, the sandpit was vacant. There was no sign of a struggle and no sound of a departing vehicle. The silence of the valley was absolute. Panic immediately surged through the mother as she began to scream his name into the mist. She checked the nearby sheds and the edge of the woods, but the youngster had vanished into the gray light of the afternoon as if he had never existed in that space at all. Shortly after the disappearance, the telephone in the residence rang. When Jean-Marie answered, the distorted voice of the Crow spoke a single, horrifying sentence. The caller claimed that he had taken the son and had already achieved his revenge against the boss. The line went dead, leaving the foreman in a state of total collapse. The authorities were notified, and a massive search was launched, involving hundreds of volunteers and specialized diving units. Several hours later, in the darkness of the evening, a discovery was made that would haunt the nation for decades. The form of the 4-year-old was located in the freezing currents of the Vallon River, several miles away from his dwelling. His hands and his ankles had been bound with a specific type of nylon cord, and his cap had been pulled down over his face. He looked as though he were merely sleeping in the reeds of the cold and rushing stream. The following morning, a final letter arrived from the Crow. It stated that the murder was the price for the foreman's social climbing, and that the author was satisfied with the outcome. The level of cruelty displayed in the communication was beyond comprehension. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in jurisdictional failure. The local magistrate, a young man with little experience, allowed the crime scene to be contaminated by the curious public. The primary suspect was a cousin named Bernard Laroche. He was a male who had a long-standing grudge against Jean-Marie and fit the physical profile of the individual seen near the river. He was arrested and held for several weeks, but due to a lack of concrete forensic proof and a retraction from a key witness, he was eventually released back into the community. This decision sent a shockwave of fury through the grieving and broken Villemin unit. Convinced that the justice system had failed him, Jean-Marie decided to take the law into his own hands. In the early months of the following cycle, he confronted Bernard Laroche outside his residence and terminated his life with a single blast from a shotgun. The foreman was immediately taken into custody, leaving Christine alone to face a fresh wave of scrutiny. The case took another surreal turn when the focus of the inquiry shifted toward the mother herself. For a period of several annual cycles, the authorities attempted to build a case against Christine, suggesting that she had killed her own son to frame the crow. They analyzed her handwriting and her movements on the day of the tragedy, putting her through a grueling ordeal of public shaming and legal pressure. It wasn't until 1993 that she was officially cleared of all charges, with the judge stating there was absolutely no proof of her guilt. The case remained a cold and painful mystery for the remainder of the century. The village of Lapangues was divided, with neighbors no longer speaking to one another and a heavy cloud of suspicion hanging over every clan gathering. The ghost of the youngster in the river continued to haunt the valley, a symbol of a justice system that had lost its way in a web of family secrets and ancient resentments that had never been properly addressed or resolved. However, as the calendar turned to the year 2000, a new hope emerged through the advancements in the science of genetic identification. The original letters and the stamps used by the crow had been preserved in the evidence lockers for 16 annual cycles. The authorities decided to reopen the files and apply the latest techniques of DNA recovery to the items. They were looking for the invisible traces of the person who had licked the envelopes. The forensic laboratory in Paris utilized a highly sensitive method of extraction to gather microscopic samples of saliva and epithelial cells from the adhesive layers of the stamps. To the surprise of the global community, the testing revealed a partial genetic profile that belonged to a female. This information immediately narrowed the list of potential suspects and suggested that the crow might not have been a single male, but a team of individuals. The discovery reignited the tensions in the Valon Valley, as the investigators began to take fresh samples from all the living members of the Villemin clan. They were looking for a match that would finally unmask the harasser who had triggered the entire sequence of tragedies. The focus turned toward the older generations of the family, women who had been present in the village during that fateful autumn and who possessed the same specific handwriting traits. While a definitive name was not immediately released to the public, the genetic evidence provided a roadmap for the future of the inquiry. It proved that the secrets of the past were no longer safe from the tools of the future. The case remains one of the most famous and complex in the record of European crime, a story of how a single act of jealousy can destroy multiple lives and leave a permanent scar on the soul of an entire rural community. Today, the Valon River still flows through the valley, its cold waters a silent witness to the events of 1984. Jean-Marie and Christine eventually moved away from the mountains, seeking a new beginning far from the whispers of the crow. But the memory of the youngster in the blue jacket remains a permanent part of the local landscape. The search for the absolute truth continues, driven by the belief that every life deserves a final answer. The legacy of the Gregory case led to a total overhaul of the French judicial process, specifically in how the authorities handled the protection of crime scenes and the rights of the accused. It served as a stark reminder of the dangers of institutional bias and the power of forensic science to bridge the gap of time. The crow may have thought their secrets were buried in the mist, but the invisible code of life had other plans for the perpetrator. As we look back on the various stories of the year 2000, from the high palaces of the East to the quiet valleys of the West, we see a common thread of a world in transition. It was a time when the old motives of jealousy, greed, and hate met the new realities of a digital and scientific age. The monsters of the turn of the century were both ancient and modern, operating in the shadows until the light of the new millennium found them. This concludes tonight's episode, 13 Stories, 13 Moments That Should Never Have Happened. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. I will see you next time. Stay safe out there.